I got to thinking recently about how I've been handling new releases from my two favorite live-action franchises, Godzilla and Star Wars. I've consistently been excited for new Godzilla, but after The Last Jedi, I've drifted towards apathy for new Star Wars. Why is that? Am I being unfair? Is there something about the way these franchises are handled that affects my perception? It really makes me curious, so I figured, why not make a video? I first want to visit my humble beginnings, starting with Star Wars. I was born in the early 90s, so no original trilogy in theaters for me, but my mom did have the trilogy on VHS. She introduced the movies to me when I was very young. I was sold, and eventually she took me to see The Phantom Menace in theaters. Still being in my single digits, I saw nothing wrong with the film. I still see nothing wrong with the film, and no wall of text can convince me otherwise. Jar Jar Binks was hilarious, and I became obsessed with Darth Maul. But what kid wasn't obsessed with Darth Maul? My younger cousin and I both ended up trick-or-treating as the character that Halloween. Repeat the theater experience with Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, and I'm a very content little teenager. Despite loving the Jurassic Park movies and being obsessed with dinosaurs as a child, and despite seeing TriStar's Godzilla, I believe as a VHS rental in '99 because I remember watching it at home, it wouldn't be until 2007 that my interest and fascination with Godzilla would take hold. Flipping through channels, I came across Stars, showing 1992's Godzilla vs. Mothra. Now with access to the internet, a new obsession was born. Still in the era of physical media stores everywhere, rest in peace, Media Play and Suncoast, I hunted around for Japanese Godzilla movies. My first ever DVD was Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. While the movie doesn't crack my top 10, the DVD will always hold a special place in my heart. Guess you never really get over your first, right? In a short time, I acquired most of the Godzilla movies, with 1984 and Biollante eluding me for a very long time. With so much history to get through, I absorbed most of the films with acceptance. I did jump on the '98 hate train though, stayed on for quite a while. 2014 would see Legendary's take on Godzilla, and 2015 would see the first Star Wars movie since Disney acquired Lucasfilm. I was very excited for both movies, Godzilla in particular, since for a long time I honestly thought I'd never get to see a Godzilla film in theaters. I ended up leaving the theater feeling lukewarm towards the movie. I was happy to see Godzilla on the big screen, but the human story felt weak and the final fart was literally too dark. The Force Awakens was a more pleasant experience. Was it an almost exact replica of A New Hope with minor tweaks? Yes, but at the time I was happy to see Star Wars back after a decade. Jumping to 2017 and 2019, I'll compare my reactions to The Last Jedi and Godzilla King of the Monsters. I was excited for Last Jedi because for one, it was more new Star Wars, and for two, the trailers made it seem amazing. Get to the theater, and 2.5 hours later, I'm staring at the credits with a dumbfounded look on my face. What could possibly have gone so wrong? 2.5 hours of film and the protagonists end up in the same position they started in. That was my biggest issue with the movie at the time, but I still had plenty of other issues with it. I was so soured on Star Wars that by the time trailers dropped for The Rise of Skywalker, I felt nothing. To this day, I still have not seen that movie. Godzilla, on the other hand, now there's a movie. King of the Monsters was fun, nostalgic, and almost without flaws. You did not need to do the Ghidorah gonorrhea joke. You did not. Now I did leave out Rogue One and Solo, so I'll touch on those briefly. They were both okay, but unnecessary. Rogue One had boring characters that you knew were going to die, and Solo had a needless backstory and you knew he was going to live. There was also Shin Godzilla in 2016. Despite being a limited US theatrical run in 2016, I still managed to see it twice. Shin Godzilla is a masterpiece, and I'll fight anyone who says otherwise. This begs the question, does age of first exposure matter to how strongly we feel about later entries to a franchise? Is it because I basically grew up on a Star Wars so controlled by George Lucas that I now reject anything outside of the original 6 movies and expanded universe books, and the Old Republic? Is it because I was already an adolescent when I saw the Japanese Godzilla with 28 pre-existing films to get through that made me significantly more tolerant of thematic and production crew variety? Would my perceptions flip if it was Godzilla in the 90s and Star Wars post-prequels? Would I be less tolerant of the MonsterVerse and more tolerant of the sequel trilogy, for instance? How would my perceptions be if I grew up with both franchises? Unfortunately, I'll never be able to answer these questions, but it is something to think about. Another factor I want to look at is how media and the stars themselves talk about the films and the fans. Granted, I can only compare the two franchises from an American's perspective since my handle on Japanese is a handful of basic characters and a 1-year-old's vocabulary. Now, I didn't pay much mind to media chatter until after The Last Jedi. Prior to that movie, I just digested the trailers and participated in fan discussions. The media had done their part. But after The Last Jedi, and particularly leading up to the release of King of the Monsters, I noticed that Hollywood really likes talking about things that are, or at least should be, inconsequential in film. While trailers were dropping and the otherwise remarkable marketing campaign was underway for King of the Monsters, articles popped up in which one of the leads in the film, Vera Farmiga, mentioned that the movie passes the Bechdel test. For those who don't know what that is, the Bechdel test is essentially a pass-fail metric where all a movie has to do to pass is have 2 female characters on screen for any length of time without talking about a man in a love interest way, which, fine, whatever. Have your win if it makes you feel fuzzy inside. This is a movie about giant monsters. The human plot and characters are going to be okay at best. However, since then, the media talking points moved back toward the monsters themselves, with Adam Wingard, director of Godzilla vs. Kong and Godzilla and Kong: The New Empire, boasting that the latter would feature several minutes at a time of uninterrupted monster fighting. The same, unfortunately, cannot be said for Star Wars. After the lukewarm, at best, reception of The Last Jedi, media outlets and cast members alike went wild with accusations of racism and sexism. Don't ask them about the Chinese poster for The Force Awakens. Rey was under fire for being a Mary Sue, Finn was under fire for being reduced to comic relief, and Rose Tico was under fire for, well, existing. Rose Tico added nothing to Star Wars, and there were valid and invalid criticisms being thrown from both sides of the conflict. For instance, the hate thrown at Kelly Marie Tran, who portrayed Rose, was completely unwarranted. Tran did not write her character, she merely played the part. The bigotry cards would come into play for every subsequent Star Wars entry, coming to a head with The Acolyte. All valid criticisms, such as the writing being bad or the costumes being horrendous for a show with such a high budget, were ignored in favor of going after mostly conjured phantoms of angry, white, basement-dwelling men being mad about black female leads and diverse casts. Another card played has been, "This wasn't made for you." Typically thrown at the men and boys of the fandom, there's been an increasing amount of female Star Wars fans, myself included, saying they don't feel represented by Rey and other female lead characters. Diversity on its own is not a problem. Star Wars is inherently diverse, with hundreds of different humanoid races. Though after Disney's acquisition of the IP, more emphasis has been made on human skin tones, ironically at the expense of galaxy-wide racial diversity. Which again, diversity on its own is fine. What fans are worried about is diversity at the expense of making good characters. I think a big issue right now is the difference between relating to a character and identifying with a character. The difference between those two phrases comes down to writing. I can identify with female characters better than I can identify with male characters, since it's just an immutable characteristic, but I can relate to a character of either gender if that character is written well. Unfortunately, I think Lucasfilm and film studios in general are focusing on characters people can identify with at the expense of writing characters people can relate to. That's most likely the crux of the problem, and I may expand my thoughts on this in a future video. Another aspect I want to explore is the soul of each franchise. The reason I think Godzilla does so well with different themes is that at the end of the day, Godzilla is always the physical manifestation of power either beyond humanity's grasp, or so destructive to wield that we're terrified of it. It's why Godzilla works as the living incarnation of the atomic bomb, as a force of nature, and as an ancient titan from an Earth we wouldn't recognize, and likely wouldn't survive. From the most somber moments to the campiest antics, Godzilla's soul remains intact. Then what of Star Wars? I wouldn't say it's the space battles or lightsaber duels, those are certainly identifying characteristics, but they're not the soul. I'd argue that the soul of Star Wars is the conflict of light versus dark, and going further, that conflict within a single character. This is clear with Luke in the original trilogy, and certainly Anakin in the prequel trilogy. They tried to do the same with Rey in the sequel trilogy, but having a female lead in the 2010s had some unnecessary challenges. And that I'll definitely dive into in a future video. At the end of it though, the Star Wars entries I've seen post-2012 have certainly been missing the franchise's soul, or at best it's been heavily fragmented. There's a lot to be said when a video game, Star Wars: The Old Republic, has a better grasp of the concept of inner conflict than the film studio itself. I think I've pondered all I need to when it comes to my reception of Godzilla and Star Wars. Godzilla is going strong in my opinion, whereas Star Wars is floundering. I really want to be excited for new Star Wars, but unless and until Lucasfilm remembers what Star Wars is really about, I think we're just going to see more duds pandering to a smaller and smaller audience. So at the end of the day, am I being unfairly harsh towards Star Wars while giving the goofiest Godzilla scenes a pass? No, I really don't think so. Star Wars is absolutely allowed to be goofy at times, but as long as it's missing the key ingredients overall, everything just falls short. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, show your support by hitting the like button, leave a comment, and share. And then check out my other videos. If you like those, subscribe for future content.